Now, after knowing the vertebral system as well as the carotid system in little bit detail, now we can come into conclusion that there are three types of the patterns of the branches are there which are going to supply the cerebrum and the other part of the brain. The first set of the pattern, that is the cortical branches, which are the branches from the main branch of the internal carotid artery as well as the vertebral artery and the basilar artery. The second type of the pattern of the arteries to the blood supply of the brain, these are the central branches, and the central branches, they are of the four groups. Some of them are branches from the anterior communicating artery, and this group they are called as the anteromedian group of the central branches. And this anteromedial group, they are going to enter the anterior perforated substance to supply the anterior limb of the internal capsule and the corpus striatum as well as the anterior part of the hypothalamus. The another group, that is the anterolateral group, and these are the mainly the branches of the middle cerebral arteries, and this anterolateral group they are going to supply the internal capsule mainly, and this anterolateral group of the central branches, they are the lateral striate branches of the middle cerebral artery, and these arteries are called as the artery of the Charcot, or it is the most common artery for the cerebral hemorrhage because of its narrow lumen and the slenderness of this artery, and that's why this artery it is called as the artery of the cerebral hemorrhage. The third group of arteries, these are the posteromedian group, and this posteromedian group they are the branches of the posterior cerebral artery, and these arteries enter within this posterior perforated substance, and they are going to supply the thalamus, hypothalamus as well as the subthalamus. And the some other group, that is the posterolateral group of the central branches, and these are from the posterior cerebral artery from the lateral side, and these arteries they are going to supply the thalamus including the geniculate bodies. So there are four types of the central branches are there. These are the anteromedial group, anterolateral group, posteromedial group and the posterolateral group. And the third type of the pattern of the artery which are going to supply the cerebrum, that is the choroidal branches, and we have already discussed this anterior choroidal artery and posterior choroidal artery. Now let's see the first type of the branch, that is the cortical branch, how it reaches up to the cerebrum and why it is important. Suppose this is the pia mater and here this is the arachnoid mater, and the cortical branches they are run within the subarachnoid space and going to form one plexus within it, and from this plexus the branches are going to pass, they pierce the pia mater and enter into the cortical substance, and some of them are very short in size and while others are very larger in size, and these branches are called as short cortical branch and the long cortical branch. But the important thing to understand that the central branches, which are the branches from the circle of the Willis, what we have discussed just before few minutes, and the central branches, they are reaching up to the inner aspect of the cerebral cortex, while these long branches, even they are not responsible for providing the proper anastomosis with the central artery, and the area between the two, that is the demarcating area for the diffusion of the blood, and this area it is the inner gray matter of the cerebrum which is the most vulnerable for the ischemic injury. So now we know that there are three branches which are going to supply the cerebrum, and these are the anterior cerebral artery, middle cerebral artery and posterior cerebral artery, and let's see the area of the distribution of these arteries by the different color. First, the anterior cerebral artery, we are going to draw it with the purple color, and this is the area of the distribution of the anterior cerebral artery. middle cerebral artery we are going to draw with the red color, while the distribution of the posterior cerebral artery we are going to draw with the green color. So, after having the proper knowledge of the area of the distribution by the anterior cerebral artery, middle cerebral artery and posterior cerebral artery to the different part of the brain, we can say that the occlusion of this anterior cerebral artery, this will lead to the affection of the upper part of the superolateral surface as well as the medial part of the orbital surface and the most of the medial surface of the cerebral cortex. And this will lead to the weakness in the leg and the foot because of the involvement of the medial side as well as the loss of the control to the defecation and micturition because of the involvement of the paracentral lobule which is present on the medial side, and it also lead to the affection in the personality, and that is because of the involvement of the prefrontal area. When occlusion to the middle cerebral artery is there, it will lead to the contralateral hemiplegia and hemiparesis to the most of the part of the body, sparing the leg and the foot. And when the dominant hemisphere sided artery is occluded, it will lead to the aphasia because of the involvement of the motor and the sensory speech areas, while the posterior cerebral arterial occlusion will lead to the contralateral homonymous hemianopia with the macular sparing, which you are going to learn detail in the spatial senses of the visual pathway. And this macular sparing by the occlusion of this posterior cerebral artery, it is just because this macular region within the occipital cortex, it is also going to be supplied by the branches from the middle cerebral artery, and that's why we can say that within the macular area of the occipital lobe, the anastomosis between the middle and the posterior cerebral arteries are there. So these are very important clinical features by which we can identify which artery is going to be occluded with the symptoms of the patient. So this is all about the arterial supply to the brain. Now let's see the venous drainage of the brain. The veins which are going to drain the brain, they are situated within the subarachnoid space, and they are going to drain into the dural venous sinuses which are actually present within the two layers of the dura mater. So this vein has to pierce the arachnoid mater and enter into the subdural space, and through the subdural space it has to pierce the meningeal layer of the dura mater to enter within the dural venous sinuses. So there are some characteristics regarding the venous drainage of the brains are there, and when we see this venous drainage of the brain, it does not follow the arterial pattern. The veins which are going to drain the brain, they are having a thin walled, and the tunica media, it is nearly absent in each vein. These veins do not have valves. These veins, they are mostly drained into the dural venous sinuses obliquely to prevent the collapse of these veins during increase in the intracranial pressure. There are three types of the venous sets are there to drain the brain, and these are the veins draining the cerebrum, veins draining the brainstem, and the veins draining the cerebellum. When we see the veins draining the cerebrum, they can be of the two types. These are the superficial and the deep veins. The superficial veins, they are actually the set of the veins they are draining, which are draining the superficial aspect of the brain, while this deep set of the veins, they are the veins which are going to drain the inner and the deep aspect of the brain. So when we see the superficial set of the veins which are going to drain the cerebrum, we can see there are three sets of the veins are there, and these are the superior, middle and the inferior veins. So before that, let's draw the venous sinuses into which these veins are going to drain. So this is the superior sagittal sinus, which is actually present in the upper border of the falx cerebri, and here the superior sagittal sinus on the right side, it is continuous with sinus, and from there this sinus it is continue as the sigmoid sinus, and the sigmoid sinus is ultimately forming the superior bulb of the internal jugular vein, which is going to continue as the internal jugular vein. So when we see the superior set of the cerebral veins, the superior cerebral veins, they are going to drain into the superior sagittal sinus in the anterior part at the right angle, while in the posterior part into the little bit obliquely. And the superior cerebral veins, they are usually 8 to 10 in number. The pattern of this superior cerebral vein to drain into the superior sagittal sinus, it prevents the collapse of this vein while increase in the intracranial pressure is there. When we see the middle cerebral vein, this middle cerebral vein may be of two types, that is the superficial middle cerebral vein and the deep middle cerebral vein. Out of them, the superficial middle cerebral vein, it is going to lie in the lateral sulcus of the brain, and this middle cerebral vein, it is anteriorly draining into the cavernous sinus, and then posteriorly it is going to drain into the superior sagittal sinus through one vein, and that is called as a superior anastomotic vein of the Trollard. And the superficial middle cerebral vein, it is also going to drain into the transverse sinus by one inferior anastomotic vein, and that is the vein of the Labe. And this superficial middle cerebral vein, it is going to drain the most of the part of the superolateral surface except the upper part of this area, which is going to drain by the superior cerebral veins. And when we see the deep middle cerebral vein, it lies in the inferior surface of the brain, which is somewhere present here in the lateral sulcus, and it is going to join the anterior cerebral vein and with some striatal veins from the anterior perforated substance, and going to form one basal vein, and this basal vein, it is called as the basal vein of the Rosenthal. And this basal vein of the Rosenthal, which is going to drain into the great cerebral vein, and this is going to join to form one straight sinus, which is on the left side, it continues with the transverse sinus. While the third set of the superficial vein, that is the inferior cerebral vein, they are going to drain the inferior surface of the cerebrum. And let's see here on this opposite side, we can see the cavernous sinus present somewhere here, and within this cavernous sinus, the superficial middle cerebral vein, it is going to drain, and on the posterior side, it is communicates with the superior petrosal sinus, and the superior petrosal sinus, it is going to enter into the right transverse sinus, which is actually the continuation of the superior sagittal sinus. And when we see the inferior cerebral veins, these are going to drain into the nearby sinuses, and they are draining the inferior surface of the cerebrum. So now let's see some other veins which are going to drain the cerebrum, and one of them we have already discussed. This is the basal vein of the Rosenthal, and this basal vein of the Rosenthal, it is going to be formed by the three veins. These are the anterior cerebral vein, deep middle cerebral vein, and some striate veins. And this anterior cerebral vein, it is the only vein which is actually corresponds with the name of its artery. Along with the three formative tributaries of the basal vein of the Rosenthal, it also having few tributaries from the optic tract and the optic chiasma, from the cerebral peduncle, from the uncus as well as the parahippocampal area, and from the interpeduncular area. Now let's see the internal cerebral veins. The internal cerebral veins, they are two in number, one on each side of the midline, and it is going to be formed by the connection of the three veins by the thalamostriate vein, one septal vein, and one choroidal vein. and these three veins, they are going to form the internal cerebral vein, and the opposite sided internal cerebral vein, both are going to fuse to form the great cerebral vein of the Galen. And this great cerebral vein of the Galen, it is going to join the inferior sagittal sinus, which is situated somewhere here, and after joining this inferior sagittal sinus, this great cerebral vein, it is continuous with the straight sinus. Within this great cerebral vein of Galen, from both the sides, the basal veins are going to join, along with the few other tributaries. So this internal cerebral vein, which is going to be formed by the fusion of the three veins, and these are the choroidal vein, thalamostriate vein, and the septal vein. And as the name suggests, this choroidal vein, it is responsible for draining the blood from the choroid plexus. This thalamostriate vein is responsible for draining the blood from the thalamus and the nearby area. And this septal vein, it is responsible for draining the blood from the septal pellucidum. So till now we have studied all the major veins of the cerebrum. Now let's see the venous drainage of the brainstem. When we see the venous drainage from the brainstem, the midbrain, from the midbrain, the veins are going to drain either into the basal vein or into the great cerebral vein of the Galen, while the veins from the pons, they are going to drain into the petrosal sinus or into the transverse sinus, while the veins from the medulla oblongata, it is going to form the plexus, and this plexus is going to drain into the basilar plexus and continuous with the veins of the spinal cord. When we see these cerebellar veins, the cerebellar veins are arranged into superior and inferior group. The superior cerebellar veins drain partly into the straight sinus, and the great cerebral vein of the Galen and partly into the transverse and the superior petrosal sinus. And the inferior cerebellar veins terminate in the sigmoid, inferior petrosal, and the occipital sinuses. So all these are the venous drainage of the brain. So this is all about the blood supply of the brain. So let's quickly revise the venous drainage of the brain. Now let's recap the venous drainage of the brain. Venous drainage of the brain can be divided into three parts of the cerebrum, of the brainstem, and of the cerebellum, where the venous drainage from the brainstem, it is from the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. From the midbrain, the veins are going to drain into the basal vein or the great cerebral vein, and from the pons, the veins will drain into the basal vein and the petrosal sinus as well as the transverse sinus, while from the medulla, the veins are going to drain into the basilar venous plexus. The venous drainage of the cerebellum, it is considered under the superior cerebellar vein as well as the inferior cerebellar vein. The superior cerebellar veins, they are going to drain into the straight sinus, great cerebral vein of Galen, and the transverse sinus as well as the petrosal sinus, while the inferior cerebellar veins are going to drain into the sigmoid sinus, transverse sinus as well as the occipital sinus. While the venous drainage of the cerebrum, it is divided into two parts, that is the external venous drainage as well as the internal venous drainage. The external sided veins, they are the external cerebral veins, and these are the superficial veins, and these include the three types of the vein, having superior cerebral veins, middle cerebral veins as well as the inferior cerebral veins. The superior cerebral veins are 8 to 12 in number and going to drain into the superior sagittal sinus, while the middle cerebral vein, there are two on each side and they are superficial or deep in nature. When we see the superficial middle cerebral veins, they are anteriorly drained into the cavernous sinus, and posteriorly they are going to drain into the superior sagittal sinus as well as the trinus as well as the transverse sinus via the superior anastomotic vein of Trollad as well as the inferior anastomotic vein of the labe respectively. While the middle cerebral vein, while the deep middle cerebral vein, it joins the anterior cerebral vein as well as the striate vein to form the basal vein. The inferior cerebral veins are many in number and they are going to drain into the transverse sinus as well as the nearby sinuses. While the internal venous structure of the cerebrum, it is one on each side, and this internal cerebral vein, it is going to be formed by the three veins, and these are the thalamostriate vein, choroid vein as well as the septal vein, and these three veins are going to form the internal cerebral veins, and both the sided internal cerebral veins, they are going to join with each other and form the great cerebral vein of the Galen. So this is all about the arterial supply and venous drainage of the brain. So hope you understand well. Thanks for watching.